The air was thick with humidity that July evening, pressing against the windows of our modest home as if the world outside knew something I didn't. I was flipping through a dog-eared novel in the living room when Isolde walked in, her steps hesitant, her hazel eyes clouded with something I couldn't place. She sank into the chair across from me at our weathered oak dining table, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of a napkin, and I knew instantly that whatever she was about to say would change everything. "Cassian told me he's in love with me," she said, her voice a fragile thread, barely audible over the hum of the ceiling fan. The words slammed into me like a freight train, knocking the breath from my chest, leaving me grasping for something solid in a world that suddenly felt like quicksand. Cassian, my brother-in-law, the man who'd married my sister, Lyra, 5 years ago in a sun-dappled backyard ceremony, surrounded by wildflowers and the laughter of people we loved. I'd known him for nearly a decade, watched him charm his way into our family with that crooked smile and those paint-stained hands, an artist who saw beauty in chaos. He'd been there for every milestone, sketching our wedding portrait with a tenderness that made Isolde cry, raising a glass at our reception with a speech that echoed in my mind for years. And now, this confession, a jagged blade slicing through the trust I'd built around him. I stared at Isolde, my wife of 7 years, searching her face for a hint of deception, a flicker of a prank, but all I saw was fear, raw and unfiltered, pooling in her eyes. She spilled the story in halting breaths, how it happened just days ago at Lyra's house after a family barbecue. The scent of grilled meat still lingering in the air as Cassian pulled her aside near the rose bushes, his voice trembling with a passion that had no right to exist. "I've loved you since the day I met you," he'd said, his words a betrayal of not just me, Thane, but of Lyra, his wife, my sister. Isolde swore she pushed him away, told him he was out of his mind, that her heart belonged to me, but the damage was already done, a crack splintering through the foundation of our lives. My mind raced, replaying every moment I'd shared with Cassian, every late-night conversation about art and life, every time he'd clapped me on the shoulder and called me brother. Had I missed the signs? Had his smiles hidden this secret all along? I shoved my chair back, the screech against the hardwood floor reverberating like a gunshot, and stormed out into the night, the sticky air wrapping around me as I tried to outrun the fury boiling in my veins. How could he do this? How could he wake up every morning next to Lyra, kiss her goodbye, and carry this poison in his heart? And what did it mean for Isolde and me, for the love we'd nurtured through years of quiet joys and petty fights? I climbed into my car and drove, the city lights smearing into streaks through the windshield, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles whitened. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay still, couldn't face the woman I loved while picturing Cassian's hands, those same hands that painted my sister's dreams reaching for her. Hours later, I returned to find Isolde asleep on the couch, her face streaked with dried tears, her body curled into itself like a wounded animal. I didn't wake her. Instead, I sank into the armchair, staring into the dark, the weight of his confession pressing down on me like a storm cloud ready to burst. Sleep never came that night, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger and disbelief, but one thing was clear. This was no isolated wound. Cassian's words were a spark, and I could feel the heat of something bigger, something uglier, simmering beneath the surface of our family. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. The first domino in a chain of horrific discoveries that would unravel everything I thought I knew, threatening to reduce the bonds we'd built to ashes. As the fog thickened outside, I sat there, heart pounding, wondering how deep this betrayal ran and what it would cost us all. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, the fog from the night before lingering like a shroud over the city, mirroring the heaviness that had settled in my chest. Isolde was already awake when I stumbled into the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow as she stirred a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. We didn't speak at first, the silence between us thick with unspoken questions, but I could see the guilt gnawing at her, as if she blamed herself for Cassian's reckless confession. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her this wasn't her fault, but the image of my brother-in-law declaring his love to my wife looped in my mind, a relentless reel I couldn't stop. Finally, I broke the quiet, my voice rough from lack of sleep. "We need to tell Lyra." Isolde's head snapped up, panic flashing across her face, but she nodded, knowing there was no way around it. Lyra, my older sister by 2 years, deserved to know what her husband had done, even if it meant shattering her world too. I grabbed my keys, the metal cold against my palm, and we drove to her house in a silence punctuated only by the hum of the engine. Every mile felt like a step closer to a cliff, and I wondered how Lyra would react, picturing her warm brown eyes crumpling with hurt. She'd always been the steady one, the glue that held our fractured family together after our parents' messy divorce decades ago, and Cassian had been her rock, her wild artist who turned her quiet life into a canvas of color. Now, that canvas was about to be slashed apart. When we pulled into her driveway, the sight of her little blue cottage with its overgrown garden and chipped paint felt like a punch to the gut. This was supposed to be a safe place, a sanctuary, not the stage for this unfolding tragedy. Lyra opened the door before we could knock, her smile fading as she took in our grim expressions. "Thane? Isolde, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry as she ushered us inside. The living room smelled of lavender and fresh paint, a half-finished canvas propped against the wall, a testament to Cassian's restless creativity. We sat on her faded green sofa, and Isolde took a shaky breath before recounting the confession, her words tumbling out like stones into still water, rippling through the room. Lyra's face went pale, her hands clenching into fists on her lap, and for a moment I thought she'd scream or cry, but she just sat there, staring at the floor, processing the betrayal of the man she'd vowed to love forever. "He said that?" she whispered finally, her voice cracking. Isolde nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks, and I reached for Lyra's hand, needing to anchor her as much as myself. But then Lyra's next words stopped me cold. "He's been acting strange for months," she said, her gaze distant. "Late nights, secretive calls, pulling away from me. I thought it was work stress, but now..." She trailed off, and a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just the sudden lapse in judgment from Cassian. It was a pattern, a thread we hadn't seen until now. I pressed her for details, my voice sharper than I intended, and she admitted he'd been disappearing for hours, claiming gallery meetings or supply runs, but always returning with a distracted air, his excuses flimsy. My stomach twisted as I realized this confession might not be the isolated betrayal I'd assumed, but a symptom of something deeper, something festering beneath the surface of their marriage. Lyra stood abruptly, pacing the room, her bare feet silent against the hardwood as she wrestled with the implications. "I need to confront him," she said, her tone hardening with a resolve I hadn't seen since she fought for custody of our childhood dog years ago. I agreed, but a part of me dreaded what we'd uncover, the nagging fear that Cassian's feelings for Isolde were just the beginning of a much uglier truth. We waited for him to come home, the clock ticking like a heartbeat, each second amplifying the tension coiling around us. When the front door finally creaked open, Cassian stepped in, his dark hair tousled, paint flecks on his jeans, and froze at the sight of us. His eyes darted between Lyra's stony glare and Isolde's tear-streaked face, and I saw the moment he knew the secret was out, his shoulders slumping under the weight of it. "Lyra, I can explain," he started, but she cut him off, her voice a whip. "Don't lie to me, Cassian. Not now." The air crackled with their standoff, and I felt the ground shift again, knowing this confrontation would peel back layers we weren't ready to face. As Lyra demanded answers, I caught a flicker of something in Cassian's expression. Not just guilt, but fear, and it hit me. He was hiding more than an illicit love. This was no simple affair of the heart. It was a doorway to secrets that could unravel our family entirely, and we were about to step through it, whether we wanted to or not. The tension in Lyra's living room was suffocating, a storm brewing in the space between us as Cassian stood there, caught like a deer in headlights, his excuses dying on his lips. Lyra's demand for the truth hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, her brown eyes blazing with a fury I'd rarely seen in her gentle soul. Isolde sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her breaths shallow as she watched the man who'd confessed his love to her face, the wife he'd betrayed. I wanted to jump in, to shake Cassian until every ounce of his deception spilled out. But this was Lyra's battle first, her marriage on the line, and I held back, my own anger simmering just below the surface. Cassian ran a hand through his tousled hair, paint-streaked fingers trembling, and finally spoke, his voice low and unsteady. "It's true, Lyra. I told Isolde I loved her. I felt it for years." The admission landed like a thunderclap, and Lyra flinched, her composure cracking as she pressed a hand to her chest as if to hold herself together. "Years," she echoed, her voice rising with disbelief. "You've been lying to me for years?" Cassian looked away, his jaw tight, and I saw the guilt etched deeper into his features. But there was something else too, a shadow of panic that didn't fit a simple love triangle. Isolde shifted beside me, her whisper barely audible. "Thane, he's not telling us everything." Her words sent a jolt through me, echoing the unease I'd felt since Lyra mentioned his odd behavior, the late nights and secretive calls that hinted at a bigger story. I leaned forward, my voice cutting through the charged silence. "What else are you hiding, Cassian? Because this isn't just about Isolde, is it?" His head snapped up, eyes wide with a flicker of dread, and I knew I'd struck a nerve. Lyra caught it too, stepping closer, her tone icy. "Tell me, now." The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as Cassian hesitated, then crumpled onto the armchair, burying his face in his hands. "It's not what you think," he mumbled, but the words felt hollow, a flimsy shield against the storm we were all bracing for. He took a ragged breath and began, his story unraveling like a thread pulled from a tapestry, revealing a pattern we'd never suspected. "It started 3 years ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I got in over my head with a gallery deal, borrowed money I couldn't repay." Lyra frowned, confusion mixing with her anger. "What does that have to do with Isolde?" she snapped, but Cassian shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It doesn't. Not directly. I was desperate, Lyra. The debt grew, and the people I owed, they weren't patient. I started doing things I'm not proud of. My stomach churned as he spoke, each word peeling back a layer of the man I thought I knew. He admitted to forging signatures on art sales, pocketing cash meant for his creditors, a tangled web of lies that kept him afloat while sinking him deeper. I pulled away from you because I didn't want you to see it, he told Lyra, his voice breaking. I was ashamed. But then he glanced at Isolde, and my blood ran cold. And Isolde, she was an escape, a fantasy I clung to when everything else was falling apart. Lyra's laugh was bitter, cutting through the room like glass. A fantasy? You destroyed us for a fantasy? I clenched my fists, the urge to lunge at him nearly overwhelming, but Isolde's hand on my arm held me back, her touch a silent plea to hear him out. Cassian's confession took a darker turn as he revealed the real cost of his lies. The people I owe, they're not just bankers, Lyra. They're dangerous. I've been dodging them for months, but they found me last week, threatened me, said I had to pay or they'd come after my family. My heart stopped, the implications crashing over me like a tidal wave. Your family? I growled, standing now, unable to stay seated. You mean us? Me, Isolde, Lyra? He nodded, his face ashen, and the room tilted as I processed the danger he'd dragged us into. Lyra's voice trembled with rage and fear. You brought this into our lives? You put us at risk over your stupid mistakes? Cassian's eyes welled up, but his tears did nothing to soften the blow. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said, but the excuse rang empty, a pathetic attempt to justify the chaos he'd unleashed. Isolde gripped my hand tighter, her whisper urgent. Thane, we're not safe. Her words ignited a protective fire in me, the realization that this wasn't just about broken trust, but survival. I turned to Cassian, my voice low and lethal. Who are these people? What do they want? He hesitated, then muttered a name. Victor Crane, a figure I vaguely recalled from whispers about the city's underbelly, a loan shark with a reputation for ruthlessness. My mind raced, piecing together the threat, the confession to Isolde now a mere footnote in a much larger nightmare. Lyra sank onto the sofa, her strength crumbling as the weight of her husband's double life settled over her. You've ruined everything, she said, her voice a hollow shell, and I felt the same despair clawing at me. This wasn't just about love or betrayal anymore. It was about the lies Cassian had buried, lies that now threatened to bury us all, pulling us into shadows we couldn't escape. As the fog pressed against the windows, I knew we were standing on the edge of something far worse, a precipice where trust was a luxury we could no longer afford. The name, Victor Crane, hung in the air like a death knell, a chilling echo that turned Lyra's cozy living room into a battlefield of fear and disbelief. Cassian's admission had stripped away the last threads of the man we thought we knew, leaving a stranger in his place, one who'd gambled not just his own life, but ours too. Lyra sat frozen on the sofa, her hands pressed against her mouth as if to stifle a scream, her eyes darting between Cassian and the floor, searching for a reality that didn't exist anymore. Isolde's grip on my hand tightened, her nails digging into my skin, a silent anchor as my mind churned with the implications of what he'd just revealed. Victor Crane, I repeated, my voice a low growl, forcing Cassian to meet my gaze. You're telling me you owe money to a loan shark, and now he's after us? Cassian nodded, his face pale and slick with sweat, his usual bravado replaced by a trembling cowardice that made me want to smash something, anything, to release the rage building inside me. How much? I demanded, stepping closer, towering over him as he shrank into the armchair. 50,000, he muttered, barely audible, and Lyra let out a strangled gasp, her hands dropping to her lap. $50,000? She cried, her voice rising with a mix of fury and despair. How did you even? She didn't finish, the question dissolving into the chaos of her thoughts, but Cassian filled the silence, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. It started small, a loan to cover a gallery flop, but the interest piled up, and I kept borrowing to stay ahead. I thought I could fix it, sell a few pieces, but nothing worked. His excuses were a pathetic litany, each one stoking the fire in my chest, but it was the threat to our safety that turned my anger into something primal. A need to protect Isolde, Lyra, and whatever was left of our family. I paced the room, the hardwood creaking under my boots, my mind racing to grasp the full scope of this nightmare. What did he say, Cassian? Exact words. He swallowed hard, his voice shaking as he recounted the encounter. Last week, outside the studio, he cornered me. Said if I didn't pay by the end of the month, he'd make sure I regretted it, that he'd find everyone I cared about. His eyes flicked to Lyra, then Isolde, and I felt a surge of nausea at the thought of this Victor Crane, a faceless predator, knowing their names, their faces. Isolde stood, her voice cutting through the haze. Thane, we can't stay here. Not if he's watching. Her words snapped me into focus, the protective instinct kicking in as I realized she was right. Lyra's house, once a haven, now felt like a target, its windows too exposed, its doors too flimsy against the danger Cassian had invited in. Lyra shook her head, her voice trembling but defiant. I'm not running from my own home because of him. She glared at Cassian, who wouldn't meet her eyes, and I saw the fracture between them widen. a chasm too deep to bridge. We don't have a choice, I said, my tone firm, trying to anchor her in the reality we faced. If he's serious, and I bet he is, we need to move, at least until we figure this out. The practicality of it clashed with the emotional wreckage around us, but survival trumped sentiment now. Cassian's next words only deepened the dread. He knows about you, Thane. I mentioned you once, trying to buy time, said my brother-in-law could help. My blood ran cold, fury and fear colliding as I grabbed him by the collar, hauling him up until our faces were inches apart. You dragged me into this? You told him my name? His eyes widened, terror flashing as he stammered. I didn't mean to, it just slipped out. I shoved him back into the chair, my hands shaking with the effort to restrain myself, knowing that every second we wasted arguing brought us closer to danger. Lyra stood, her resolve hardening despite the tears streaking her face. We need to go to the police, she said, but Cassian shook his head violently, panic overtaking him. No, that'll make it worse. Victor's got people everywhere, he'll know, he'll come faster. His fear was contagious, seeping into me as I weighed our options, each one bleaker than the last. Isolde's voice broke through, steady despite the chaos. We need a plan, Thane. We can't just sit here waiting for him to show up. She was right, her clarity cutting through my spiraling thoughts, and I nodded, forcing myself to think past the betrayal, past the urge to throttle Cassian for what he'd done. We decided to leave, at least for the night, to buy time and distance from the threat. Lyra packed a bag, her movements mechanical, her silence louder than any words, while Isolde gathered essentials from our car, her efficiency a lifeline in the storm. Cassian sat slumped, useless, a broken man who'd lost the right to lead us out of this mess he'd created. As we loaded up, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on us, the fog outside cloaking potential threats, every rustle of leaves a warning. Where we go? Lyra asked, her voice small as she climbed into the back seat, clutching her bag like a shield. Somewhere safe, I said, though I wasn't sure such a place existed anymore. A motel on the edge of town, cash only, no questions asked, became our refuge, a temporary shield against the shadow of Victor Crane. Driving through the night, the road stretching dark and endless, I glanced at Isolde beside me, her face etched with worry, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. Cassian's confession had been the spark, his debts the fuel, and now we were all caught in the blaze, running from a danger we couldn't see but could feel closing in. The motel's neon sign flickered as we pulled in, a grim beacon in the fog, and I knew this was just a pause, a breath before the next revelation, the next fight to keep us whole. The motel room smelled of stale cigarettes and damp carpet. A far cry from the warmth of Lyra's cottage or the comfort of my home with Isolde. But it was a fortress for now, its anonymity our only shield against the storm Cassian had unleashed. We piled in just before dawn, the fog outside clinging to the windows like a living thing, muffling the world beyond as we collapsed into the dim space. Lyra dropped her bag by the door and sank onto one of the sagging twin beds, her face a mask of exhaustion and betrayal, her silence heavier than any outburst. Isolde paced near the window, peering through the blinds every few minutes, her vigilance a mirror to my own restless energy as I stood by the door, listening for any sound that didn't belong. Cassian slumped in the corner chair, his head in his hands, a broken figure who dragged us into this abyss with his lies and debts. $50,000 to Victor Crane, a name that now haunted every breath we took, a loan shark who'd turned our family into collateral for Cassian's mistakes. The weight of it all pressed down on me, Thane, the one who'd always fixed things, from busted bikes as a kid to Lyra's tears after our parents split, but this felt beyond repair, a fracture too deep to mend. We can't hide forever, Isolde said, her voice steady despite the fear lurking in her eyes, and I nodded, knowing she was right, knowing we had to face this head-on or risk losing everything. The plan formed in fits and starts, born from desperation as the gray light of morning seeped through the curtains. Lyra broke her silence, her voice raw but resolute. I have some savings, maybe 20,000. We could use it to buy time. Her offer stunned me, a lifeline thrown from the wreckage of her marriage, but Cassian shook his head, his voice hoarse. It won't be enough. Victor doesn't negotiate, he demands. I wanted to believe Lyra's money could soften the blow, but Cassian's fear told me otherwise, and I hated him more for it, for stripping us of even that sliver of hope. Isolde stopped pacing, her gaze locking onto mine. What about selling something? The house, the car, anything? The thought of losing our home, the place where we'd built 7 years of memories, twisted my gut, but survival trumped sentiment now. It'd take too long, I said, my mind racing for another way, a faster fix to this nightmare. Then Cassian spoke, his words tentative, almost drowned by shame. I have paintings, originals, stashed at the studio. They're worth something, maybe enough to cover it. My jaw clenched at the irony. His art, the very thing that started this mess, now our potential salvation. Lyra's laugh was sharp, cutting through the tension. You think your scribbles can fix this? After everything? But I saw the flicker of possibility, a desperate grasp at a solution, and I latched onto it. We'll get them, I said. decision made, the need to act overriding the chaos in my heart. The drive to Cassian's studio was a blur. The city waking around us as we moved through streets bathed in pale light, every shadow a threat, every stranger a potential enforcer of Victor Crane's will. Cassian led us to a rundown warehouse on the edge of town, its rusted door creaking as we slipped inside, the air thick with turpentine and dust. Canvases lined the walls, bold strokes of color that once seemed alive, but now felt like relics of a life he'd squandered. He pointed to a stack in the corner, 5 pieces he swore could fetch $60,000 on the black market, enough to pay off the debt and buy our freedom. I didn't trust him, not anymore, but we had no choice, and I helped load them into the car, my hands shaking with adrenaline and dread. Isolde kept watch, her quiet strength steadying me as Lyra stood apart, her eyes fixed on Cassian with a mix of loathing and loss. "This better work," she muttered, and I felt the same desperate hope clawing at me, the slim chance that we could outrun this disaster. Back at the motel, I made calls, tapping old contacts from my college days, people who knew the underground art scene, arranging a sale with a buyer willing to move fast for cash. The waiting was agony, hours stretching into eternity as we sat in that cramped room, jumping at every noise, the paintings our fragile lifeline. When the deal went through, $55,000 in hand, relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Cassian had to face Victor, deliver the money, end this himself, and none of us trusted him to do it alone. We drove to the meet, a deserted lot under a flickering streetlight, the fog curling around us like a shroud. Victor was there, a hulking figure with cold eyes and a scar across his cheek, his presence radiating menace as Cassian handed over the cash, stammering apologies. "It's all here," he said, and Victor counted it, his silence more terrifying than any threat. He nodded once, a curt acknowledgement, then turned to me, his voice gravelly. "You're lucky he's got you, Thane. Next time, I won't be so patient." The warning chilled me, a reminder that this wasn't over, not fully, but he left, disappearing into the night, and we stood there, breathless, alive. Back at the motel, Lyra faced Cassian, her voice steady. "I'm done. You're out of my life." He didn't argue, just nodded, broken beyond repair. Isolde squeezed my hand, her eyes meeting mine, a silent vow that we'd survive this. The cost was steep, trust shattered, bonds frayed, but we'd fought through the darkness, paid in cash and tears to reclaim our lives from the brink. As dawn broke, the fog lifting, I knew the scars would remain, but so would we, standing together against the ruins Cassian left behind.